Good morning, Year 10. Today we're going to study for our second lesson the beginnings of War Photographer, and we're going to start looking at the themes that we will approach on Friday as we annotate it. It's by Carol Ann Duffy, who is our current Poet Laureate. So I want you to take either a Google Doc or regular A4 paper and write notes on this that you will keep with your annotated copy of the poem. Let's get started then. Alright, so you need to start by making notes on the poet, because as you write your thesis statement at the beginning of your essay about War Photographer, you will need to give some details about why the poet chose this as a theme and this as a subject. So, let's talk about Carol Ann Duffy, and you can take these notes down. Don't just write down what's in the PowerPoint. Please add to that with what I say. So she is our current Poet Laureate, and that is a very prestigious and influential position, and her poems are published and promoted as part of our government scheme, as she is our official Poet Laureate. This is one of her earlier poems, and it was published in 1985, and that's really important to remember because the subject she uses to create the metaphor of developing photographs was well known during this time period in the 1980s, and everyone would have understood very quickly what she was talking about and the themes. A photograph was developed by taking pictures which were on a film, and in order to develop the photograph, one would have to go into a very dark room with a very gentle, soft red light, and then open the film canister and very carefully put the film into a solution, and then very slowly the photographs would appear and could be printed. This is not the same at all as how we just plug a digital device in and print. Very, very differently captured. And if light was exposed, was shown to the film, all the photos were ruined. So the contrast between light and dark was very important. She also had good friends who were famous war photographers, and she was really interested on the difficult decisions and the situations that her friends had to live in as they went around terrible, terrible conflict situations and saw terrible, terrible things and came back quite affected by them, potentially with even, as we would see now, as PTSD from what they'd seen and experienced, in a similar way to the soldier in the Remains poem. So, let's have a look at some war photography. Of course, don't forget to pause the video and make sure you take the notes about Carol Ann Duffy before you move on to this section. But I've got a couple of photographs taken during the war, and I wanted to show you the kinds of situations that war photographers were working in. They would be taking pictures of people who were deeply, deeply suffering and in danger of their lives. Here there are Rohingya children who are fleeing because they are about to be murdered as they've seen their parents. You can also see their parents in the background, and they are desperately trying to get to Bangladesh to be safe. So these war photographers are seeing these people suffering, and they are unable to do anything about it. They are just having to record it. This is quite an old picture during the napalm gas attacks in Vietnam, and it's a very famous one, as the little girl whose clothes are missing had them burned off her body, and the soldiers were ripping them off her body because they were burning her skin. So these children were escaping being burned to death by terrible, terrible gases. This lady has later, when she's been safe, she's moved to America, and she's written her own poetry to forgive her attackers. So this is an incredibly famous image of terrific amounts of terrible suffering, but the war photographer cannot help them. It's his job to just take pictures of what is happening. Here are two more pictures, really awful ones. They're actually taken by two different photographers. This is a picture of a very famous incident in Vietnam that was captured by a lot of war photographers, where a man was executed right in the middle of the street in front of many, many people and just left dead on the ground. And the war photographers were not allowed to intervene. They were responsible to their newspapers and to their editors for taking the proof of it happening so that the people back home could see it, but they couldn't intervene. And it was very hurtful to them that they could do nothing. Of course, the idea of war photography is not a brand new one. We have plenty of real photographs during the World War I. This one is of as the machine gun post just on one side of the trenches were protecting the soldiers, who you can just see in the background, and from who were coming out of the trenches and going into no man's land to try and attack the German trenches. In the Somme, you can see the situations that the war photographers themselves were living in. This was not a safe place for him to be, and many war photographers are killed by bullets going astray or being aimed at them by the other side, as they do not want what is going on to be captured and sent back to the other countries, to their enemies. Additionally, the country itself in England did not want real pictures of what was happening in the World War, exposing how many people were dying, as they desperately needed more soldiers to be recruited. So they couldn't exactly tell the people back home that you were going to your death if you became a soldier, which was quite a certain way of explaining it. They wanted them, but they didn't want to tell them where they were going and what it was like. So war photographers were not very popular among their own people, and that's why very few photographs of some of the earlier wars, like World War I, have survived, because war photography as part of a regular and free press is a relatively new idea, as usually the governments tried to control the images that were sent home so they could control the populace. Okay, finally the last 3 slides now. A lot of the pictures in modern day pictures, you can see these are color pictures. They're not very long ago at all. The bottom right one of the woman and her family are of Syrian refugees from a year or 2 ago. These are real people. These are not soldiers. These are civilians. And war photography involved civilian photographers coming into contact with other civilians. So they weren't trained to be able to deal with the fact that they were going to be emotionally affected by what they saw, and bleeding little children and injured families and terrified people whose families members have been executed in front of them was not something they expected to see necessarily when they became a war photographer. Once they had started, it must have been very difficult to stop being a war photographer, because they were very much on the critical edge of photography, and going back into a studio must have seemed very tame to them. Have a look at the suffering and the pain in these photographs, and they are very much imbibing this suffering. They're seeing it all the time. They're surrounded by it, and in fact that is what they are supposed to be looking at. So soldiers can walk past and just focus on the job, whereas this is the photographer's job. The photographer's job is to focus on the pain and suffering and record it. The soldiers can very likely just think about the consequences in terms of safety and peace of the area. That's not one of the things that a war photographer can do, unfortunately. So their job is very different. And as we know, photography carries on. Both sides do it. So this is a photograph taken by the other side, as ISIS executes who they would call an enemy to themselves, and they use these images from their own war photographers as a part of propaganda to show their power and influence. These photographs, when they are published, of course, show stories to the Western world of the age of the victims and the suffering that the victims are undergoing. And so the war photographers on both sides of conflicts, they either use them as propaganda, or they can use them to expose the real situations, as we've seen before. And finally, we know that there is war and suffering ongoing constantly. That there has never been a time in the last 100 years when there's been no conflict. And the current conflicts that we have undergoing are the refugees coming over from Syria, but are also a conflict that we don't talk about a lot at the moment, which is the current civil wars going on in Yemen, which started in 2015. These are images of children who were taken into UN hospitals, children and teenagers who are starving to death. So war photographers have to look at these absolutely harrowing images of serious amounts of suffering, and then they have to send these photographs home, hoping that they will convey some of the serious problems going on as part of these conflicts. Now, soldiers don't usually deal with these kinds of situations. A soldier will deal with the actual fighting and the actual conflict itself, whereas the war photographer documents what happens afterward. And it's the emotional problems rather than the actual violent ones. So you should expect to see some sort of major emotional conflict going on here, using the war photographer as a poem. So now we're going to start looking at what we have to do when we look at the war photographer. It would be really useful at this point if you were able to have printed out or written out the war photographer poem that I gave you in the Google Doc. So take a moment to do that before you move on. Alright, these are the last 4 slides. Now that you will have your notes at the end of these 4 slides, then you will be done with today's work. And if you want to make sure that you keep your notes very safe, because these are what you're going to use when you start preparing to take your GCSE. And we're going to use those notes all term this term, except the last few weeks, when we go through all the poems and compare them each against another to see what the poets are saying in comparison to each other. So what should we focus on? I've given you 4 things to focus on the right hand side, and they relate to how I'm going to keep using my highlighters. So I'm highlighting the tone, I'm highlighting in another color the form and structure, I'm highlighting in another color the language terminology, so your alliteration, all your SOAP aims, as you've remembered from this morning. And I'm also highlighting in another color, sometimes I do 2, I'm trying not to do 2 because it's too complicated to have 5 colors. And these are the images and the allusions to images that will help us to formulate our argument. Okay, so that we can go to that color first when you're thinking, right, I need to have an argument. What can I say that the poet is trying to do here? Where's the message? And it's usually in the imagery. Right, so I want you to write down those 4 points and the colors that you've been using when you do your annotation. And then I want you to write down those 7 points on the other side of the slide. This is what we have to do in order to do well in a poetry analysis question. I know that a lot of you are very afraid of this. It's not something you've done a lot at high school. And I want to show you how to do well. You must always start with a thesis, which is basically an argument or a message, and say, what is the poet saying? What is their message? There are many different messages that you could come up with. The poet does not have just one message. Anyone can read in a different message. So every essay that the examiners will read will say something slightly different, and that's good. And the whole point of writing the essay at all is to prove your thesis. So you can show from your writing from the thesis point onward that the thesis is actually true. And that is really what they are actually trying to say. Number 2 is that you have to pick out your references to prove your thesis, but you have to pick them out carefully. So when we've been using them with Macbeth and with Jekyll and Hyde, we've been using 3 or 4 references in a paragraph and linking them together. Sometimes we have to be careful of that with poetry, because poetry is very, very full of references and it's a small space. So almost anything could be a reference. So we have to pick the best. Just like we had our Jekyll and Hyde reference cards, I'm going to suggest the best ones and that you memorize them, or that you learn them so that you can at least talk about them really clearly and not have to rethink it every time you see that poem and go, oh, what were the references now? You will just know what and where to look for them. And when we use the references, instead of using lots of references, we really take that one reference apart. So if you're going to write an essay that has a thesis statement, it has 5 paragraphs and a closing paragraph, you want 5 references and you want 5 good ones. Your third point is that you have to write about the beginning and the ending of the poem. So you need at least 1 paragraph at the beginning and then 1 paragraph about the ending to show whether the poet leaves the readers with the point that they're trying to make, or whether it's a cyclical structure and they just show that fate is in control and it's just going to be a terrible spiral that continues forever. Point 4 is that you should, and this is quite useful, and the better you are at this, the better your grade will be. If you've got a thesis, you found your personal interpretation, okay? And then you're going to use every reference to prove that. But some references you could use to prove lots of different things. So you have to be willing to look at the alternatives, show the possibilities of what else that reference could be showing. Number 5, you must analyze how the form of the poem shapes the way the poet wants the readers to understand this thesis message. Okay, we are looking at form a lot. Form and structure go well together, but you must talk about both, or else you miss out on the high marks. You're stuck at 5. That's it. You can't get any further unless you talk about form and structure. And form is rhyme, rhythm, and poem type. And structure, so you must analyze for number 6, how the structure of the poem shapes the way the poet wants the readers to understand the message. And structure is different, it's bigger, and it's the phrasing, who the speaker is, whether there's listing or repetition. Is it a circular poem shape? Okay, so for form, we're talking about the really specific words like iambic, pentameter, and sonnet. And for structure, we're talking about how a list halfway through really focuses your attention on it, and the fact that the start is the same as the end, so it shows that it's a cyclical structure and fate is in control and it's never-ending spiral downward. Talk about both. And number 7, we have to use our correct language terminology, SOPAIMs, and you will use SOPAIMs, and you will use more SOPAIMs. And as long as you can find them and remember them, then you are going to be fine with number 7. Let's move on then, once you have written those 7 really important points down. If we can look very quickly at form, structure, and a little tiny bit at the bottom about the imagery and allusions, then you are basically almost halfway through annotating it without actually annotating it. So the form of this poem, just take notes in your notes, so either alongside the poem or on the back of the poem, but if you're going to stick it in, try another page. So write those 4 bullet points down. It's made up of 4 stanzas, each with 6 lines. It is very organized. It is a very traditional structure because the rhyme scheme is very organized. So the main theme here, if we're talking about form having a theme, is, and we're contributing to the message, is that it's an organized situation and it's a traditional organized poem. So it's got an iambic meter. It's not always pentameter, which means there's tens, which 2 groups of 5, or it could be a different one. It could be 12 or 11 and miss the end, but usually it's an iambic meter. And at the end of each stanza there are some rhyming couplets, which, as we know from Macbeth, rhyming couplets indicate that the character is about to walk off stage. That's the end. So each of the stanzas can be taken individually as proving its own point, because at the end of each stanza there's a rhyming couplet, so that is the end of that point. So when you're coming up with your thesis, the form is really informing the thesis. Not that the poet is trying to make 4 individual points, but that they move through their points. These 4 points are trying to prove their ultimate message. And they use these 4 as individual points to prove their message. So it would be a really good idea if you had, of your 5 quotations, there would be 1 out of each stanza, so you could show how the form moves. So let's have a look then at the structure. Pause the video now and make sure you write down the notes about what I've said and the notes on the screen. Alright, so the structure shows the contrasts. The form is very organized and very structured. However, the structure is not. The structure shows that actually we've got contrasts between almost everything, and the contrast that's mainly brought out is between organization of the form and the chaos of everything else. So that is the main contrast being brought out, that between organization and chaos. So here are some of the ways that the structure is being done. Caesura and enjambment are used to stop and start and make us read faster or make us read slower. There are listing. It's very common Carol Ann Duffy technique where she does listing with a full stop at the end of each item in the list rather than a comma, because it makes a full stop makes you stop. And it really slows the reader down, and they get this message. And include, if we use plosives, which are either a B or a P, which make our lips come together and make a P sound, then you get that P sound, which sounds a bit like shooting or gunfire. And those plosives, if you combine them with the list, my goodness, that's strong as a structure. And the juxtaposition between the photograph and the photographer, and their 2 sides, the photograph and then the photographer, and the images in the photograph and the images of that we will get of this photographer character. So that's done by using short sentences and then long sentences. And then it's also done by moving between the stanzas doing this. It's done by the language, but we are seeing juxtaposition, which is a structure, and we are seeing it done, this juxtaposition, in lots of different ways. And then of course we've got, as I said, the short sentences, so it brings out the contrast between the then followed long sentences. So with the full stops, you have to stop and then start again, and it slows you down. That caesura of the full stop in the middle of the line slows you down. Now make sure you take notes on the fact that there are these literary techniques of caesura, enjambment, plosives, full stops, juxtaposition, short sentences and long sentences, and then we're going to use that information when we actually annotate it. Okay, pause the video while you do that and we'll move on. And this is the final slide. As I said, Wednesdays was going to be much shorter. The imagery and illusions that we're going to get as part of our SOAP aims are really focusing on these 6 contrasts. So you need to write them down. The contrasts between life and death you will see in the imagery. Light and faith are compared and contrasted. The hope from religion and then despair. The pain from the suffering, but then there's peace. The images in the photos, and then the people that were photographed themselves. And then also you get the contrast between the people who look at the photographs and the photographer who took the photographs. So these are really important pieces of imagery that we are shown throughout this poem, and there are allusions which relate to them. And these are really useful ways of talking about part of our SOAP aims, and I would hope you would include these if you do write about the SOAP aims. As I say, when you do SOAP aims, you can combine them. So we can have the imagery of a metaphor working with an allusion as well as some alliteration layered on top, and then a very short full stop at the end. All of those together are really useful words. We can almost include every part of the SOPAMES in every essay because they are all layered up so much. All right, so you now have taken the notes on these last 4 slides, and on the slides with the photographs, and on Carol Ann Duffy. So you are now ready to annotate the poem, which we will do on Friday, and we will finish off the War Photographer poem this week. So we're only having 2 days on it. I really hope you're having an okay time with this work being on videos. If you're not, please send an email and say, Miss, I really would prefer this as a PowerPoint. But I've noticed that almost everybody prefers it as a video. I'm quite happy to use both if it would help some people who do not like the video version. Okay, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Bye everyone.